If someone with an avoidant attachment style pulls away like this, it can feel like there's still a chance they'll return if you just wait long enough, say the right thing, or show them more love. It creates this quiet hope that distance is temporary and that they will eventually realize what they lost. But in many cases, what looks like uncertainty from the outside is already something they've mentally settled. The connection may have felt real to you, but inside their experience, they may have already started shifting into emotional distance long before anything ended. So what feels like an unfinished story to you has often already been rewritten in their mind. That's why waiting for a change that depends entirely on their return can keep you stuck in a loop that doesn't move forward. What often happens is not a dramatic breakup, but a slow internal exit. They don't always leave with conflict or emotional explosions. Instead, they gradually disconnect, become quieter, less emotionally available, and start creating space between themselves and the relationship. Over time, that space turns into emotional separation long before the physical one happens. By the time they actually leave, they've usually already accepted the idea of life without the relationship. It doesn't come from sudden anger, but from a sense of relief they've built internally. That relief is what makes the absence feel resolved for them, even if it feels unfinished and painful for the other person. Avoidant individuals often struggle with sustained emotional closeness. While they may enjoy connection in short moments, deeper intimacy can start to feel overwhelming or restrictive to them. Instead of expressing that discomfort openly, they tend to turn inward and rationalize it. They may begin telling themselves that the relationship is limiting their independence or that they are losing themselves in it. This inner narrative grows stronger over time and becomes a justification for withdrawal. In their mind, leaving is not an emotional reaction, but a necessary decision for self-protection. Long before they physically step away, they have often already rehearsed the ending many times internally, which is why the final detachment can seem surprisingly calm and certain. For the person left behind, the most painful part is often the silence and lack of visible struggle. It can feel like they didn't care, but in reality, they may have already reached emotional closure on their side. That's why chasing explanations or trying to reopen connection often leads nowhere. If someone has already decided that distance feels safer than intimacy, no amount of effort from the outside can override that internal belief. At that point, continuing to reach out can only drain you further while they remain unmoved. The responsibility of healing that pattern is not something you can carry for them, even if you understand it deeply. When an avoidant person feels settled in their decision, what replaces confusion is often calm acceptance of the distance. That emotional calm can be misleading because it looks like peace, but it actually reflects detachment rather than resolution together. They are not typically revisiting the relationship once that state is reached, especially if reconnecting would force them back into vulnerability they've already chosen to avoid. For you, the important shift is recognizing that absence, when it is met with emotional neutrality on their side, is often a conclusion rather than a pause. And while that realization can be difficult, it also becomes the point where you stop building your life around the possibility of someone returning who has already internally left. When an avoidant partner ends a relationship, their experience of separation often looks very different from someone with a secure or anxious attachment style. One of the most painful realizations for the person left behind is that the avoidant may not appear to miss them in any obvious or motivating way. While others might feel pulled to revisit memories, reach out, or sit with a sense of loss, avoidant individuals are more likely to turn inward and focus on restoring their sense of independence. This doesn't mean the relationship had no meaning. It's more that the emotional experience of missing someone requires sustained openness to longing, and that level of vulnerability is exactly what they tend to struggle with most. For many avoidant individuals, emotional closeness eventually starts to feel overwhelming rather than comforting. What feels natural and connecting to one person can begin to feel intrusive or consuming to them. So when they step away, they often don't sit in a space of emotional emptiness in the same way others might. Instead, what shows up is often a sense of relief. Relief from emotional pressure, from expectations, from having to constantly engage with feelings that feel intense or difficult to process. From the outside, that relief can easily be mistaken for coldness or indifference, but internally, it often functions as a way to calm their nervous system and regain balance after feeling emotionally flooded. Because of this, their version of missing someone rarely looks like reaching out or trying to reconnect. It is often replaced by internal justifications that help solidify the separation. They may tell themselves the relationship wasn't right, that there was too much emotional intensity, or that they lost themselves in it. These thoughts are not always calculated in a conscious way. They often serve as a protective narrative that reduces emotional discomfort and helps them stay grounded in their decision. In some cases, they may even mentally focus more on what felt difficult in the relationship, not necessarily because those moments define everything, but because highlighting them makes distance feel more certain and easier to maintain. Meanwhile, the person left behind is often processing a very different emotional reality. Grief, confusion, and longing can feel intense and ongoing, especially when the connection felt real and meaningful. It can be hard to understand how someone could seem to move forward so quickly or appear unaffected. But in many cases, the emotional withdrawal began long before the actual separation. By the time the relationship ends externally, the internal detachment has already been in progress for a while. That difference in timing creates the emotional mismatch that feels so painful and confusing. What's important to recognize is that this isn't about your value or the depth of what you felt. It's about different nervous systems and different ways of handling emotional intensity. For someone avoidant, shutting down can feel like protection. For you, the absence feels like loss. Both experiences are real, but they unfold in completely different emotional timelines. When someone with an avoidant attachment style pulls away from a relationship, it's very common to start turning the situation inward and questioning yourself. You may replay everything that happened and wonder if you were too emotional, too dependent, or somehow too much for them to handle. That kind of thinking can quickly become a cycle of self-doubt and overanalysis. But in most cases, their withdrawal is not a reflection of your value or your behavior. It is rooted in patterns within them that existed long before the relationship even began. Avoidant individuals often carry early emotional conditioning that taught them, directly or indirectly, that closeness is unsafe or overwhelming, and that relying on others can lead to discomfort or loss of control. Because of that internal programming, emotional intimacy in adulthood can activate a strong sense of discomfort or threat for them. As a relationship deepens, instead of feeling more secure, they may start to feel like they are losing their independence or emotional breathing space. They don't always express this openly. Instead, they tend to withdraw, create distance, or emotionally shut down. From the outside, this can look like coldness or lack of care, but internally, it often feels like self-protection. The more emotionally present and loving their partner is, the more intense that internal pressure can sometimes become, not because love is wrong, but because it conflicts with their learned fear of dependency and vulnerability. This is why it can be so damaging to interpret their distancing as evidence that you weren't enough. Their reaction is not a measurement of your worth. It is a reflection of their capacity to tolerate closeness in that moment. Even if you showed up with patience, care, and emotional honesty, the outcome can still remain the same if they are not able to stay present with intimacy when it becomes emotionally demanding. In many cases, they are not rejecting you as a person. They are retreating from the emotional intensity that the relationship brings up inside them. Understanding this distinction is important because it helps separate your identity from their coping strategy. When a person with avoidant tendencies leaves and refuses to engage in meaningful conversation afterward, it often creates a painful lack of clarity. You are left searching for answers, trying to make sense of what changed or what went wrong. It's natural to believe that closure should come through discussion, explanation, or one final conversation that ties everything together. But with avoidant dynamics, that level of emotional engagement is often exactly what they are trying to avoid. Direct conversations about feelings, responsibility, and endings can feel overwhelming for them, so they may step back further instead of leaning in. Sometimes they don't completely disappear, but their responses remain shallow, distant, or disconnected, which can feel even more confusing than no contact at all. It leaves you stuck between presence and absence, hoping for clarity that never fully arrives. In that space, it's easy to keep trying, sending messages, asking questions, or looking for the right way to get them to open up. But often, their lack of response or emotional depth is already communicating what you need to know. It may not be spoken clearly, but it is still information. They are not engaging on an emotional level. As painful as it is, closure does not always come from them. Sometimes it comes from recognizing that the answers you are hoping for are not going to be given in the way you expect. The moment you stop relying on their explanation to bring you peace is often the moment you begin to regain emotional ground. Letting go of the need to decode silence doesn't erase what happened, but it does stop you from staying stuck in it. When someone walks away and shows no real effort to work through what happened, no openness to communicate, and no willingness to stay emotionally engaged, you're left standing at a crossroads. At that point, you either keep holding on in hope that they'll return, or you begin choosing yourself and moving forward. Letting go is rarely easy. Your mind starts replaying everything, the conversations, the chemistry, the meaningful moments, and it can feel impossible not to believe it meant as much to them as it did to you. But eventually, a more difficult question starts to surface. What exactly am I still waiting for? If the person who left isn't making any effort to reflect, repair, or reconnect, then waiting for them slowly shifts from love into something else, often fear. Fear of losing what felt special, fear that no one else will make you feel the same way, fear that if you let go, you're closing the door on something irreplaceable. Those thoughts can feel convincing, but they also keep you emotionally stuck in a place where you're giving energy to someone who is no longer meeting you halfway. And over time, that waiting can turn into a quiet form of self-abandonment, where your own needs and healing are placed on hold for the possibility of someone else's return. Choosing yourself in that moment doesn't mean you didn't care. It means you're starting to recognize that real connection requires mutual participation. Someone can feel something for you and still not be capable of showing up in the way a healthy relationship requires. Missing you is not the same as choosing you. Regret is not the same as consistency. And without consistent action, love cannot really grow in a stable direction. When that effort isn't present, it becomes important to stop focusing on what could have been and start acknowledging what is actually happening in front of you. There is a certain strength in deciding to stop chasing, not from anger or resentment, but from clarity, because real love does not place you in a position where you have to constantly prove your worth or carry the emotional weight alone. It doesn't disappear when things become real or demanding. Instead, it stays present, even in discomfort. A healthy connection doesn't make you feel like you are asking for too much simply by wanting consistency and care. It meets you with effort, not avoidance, and with presence, not confusion. So if you find yourself stuck in the loop of waiting, analyzing, and trying to understand how someone could be close one moment and gone the next, this is where the shift begins. When someone consistently chooses distance over repair, silence over honesty, and relief over reconnection, their actions are already communicating the direction of things, even if nothing is said clearly. You don't need endless explanations to validate what is already being shown through behavior. And while that realization can be painful, it also brings clarity. You are allowed to close the chapter without waiting for them to finish it for you. You are allowed to move forward without full understanding. Healing does not require their apology, and peace does not require their return. What it does require is your willingness to stop standing at a door that is no longer opening. So instead of waiting in that space, you start redirecting your energy back to yourself. You rebuild your boundaries, reconnect with your own life, and slowly stop negotiating your worth with someone who is not present. Because the more you choose yourself, the clearer it becomes that love should not feel like chasing, guessing, or shrinking. It should feel like safety, clarity, and mutual effort. What you're really dealing with in these situations isn't just the absence of a person, it's the absence of reciprocity. That mismatch creates a very specific kind of emotional pull where your mind keeps trying to solve the ending. You don't just miss them, you try to make sense of them. You replay interactions not because there is a missing answer, but because your nervous system is still looking for resolution in something that ended without emotional completion. That's why it can feel so sticky. The story didn't close in a shared way, so your mind keeps trying to finish it alone. A big part of the struggle comes from how connection gets encoded in your system. When someone is emotionally available at times, and then suddenly distant or gone, it creates intermittent reinforcement. That inconsistency can intensify attachment far more than steady connection ever would. Your brain starts to associate that person with emotional highs and unresolved tension at the same time, so even when the relationship is no longer healthy or mutual, your internal system still reacts as if something important is unfinished. That's not a sign that the connection is meant to be continued. It's just how the brain responds to unpredictability and emotional contrast. Another layer is the identity impact. When you invest emotionally in someone, especially deeply, they don't just exist as a partner in your life. They become part of your emotional landscape. So when they leave without repair or clarity, it can feel like a disruption in your sense of stability. You're not only processing loss, you're also adjusting to the absence of a future you are already building internally. That's why the mind keeps going back, trying to reconstruct what changed, as if understanding it perfectly will restore a sense of control. But in most of these dynamics, control is exactly what the other person has already stepped away from. The moment someone chooses distance and maintains it, the power of closure shifts away from dialogue and into behavior. That can feel unfair because you're still emotionally engaged while they've already disengaged. However, emotional timing is often uneven. One person exits internally long before anything is said out loud, which is why their calm or detachment can feel so confusing compared to your ongoing emotional intensity. In the end, what hurts most in these situations is not only the loss of the person, but the collapse of the story you were still holding on to. You weren't just connected to who they were in the present moment. You were also connected to what the relationship meant in your mind, what it could have become, and what you believed it was building toward. So when they step away without the same emotional struggle, it creates a deep internal disorientation. It feels like you are still inside the relationship emotionally, while they have already exited it completely. That mismatch is where most of the pain lives. because it forces you to sit with an experience that has no shared processing on the other side. Over time, you begin to see that the mind doesn't let go simply because something ended. It lets go when it stops receiving reinforcement. If you are still checking, still hoping, still interpreting silence, still revisiting memories for meaning, then, in a way, the connection is still being kept alive internally. Not because you are doing something wrong, but because your system is trying to make sense of an unfinished emotional loop. But clarity does not come from staying inside the loop. It comes from stepping outside of it long enough to see that there is no additional message coming, no hidden ending waiting to be revealed, and no final conversation that will suddenly rewrite what has already happened. A difficult truth in emotional healing is that closure is not something someone gives you. It is something you eventually stop needing from them. There may never be a perfectly satisfying explanation that makes everything click into place. And waiting for that explanation often becomes another form of attachment, because it keeps your attention tied to the person who is no longer participating in your emotional world. At some point, continuing to seek meaning from someone who has chosen distance only extends your own confusion. Letting go is not a single moment of decision. It is a gradual withdrawal of energy from a direction that no longer returns it. At first, it feels unnatural because your mind is still oriented toward them. You may still think about what they are doing, whether they miss you, whether they will return, or whether something will change. But slowly, as you stop feeding those questions with attention, they begin to lose urgency, not because you suddenly stop caring, but because your emotional investment starts returning to you instead of being projected outward. What eventually replaces the confusion is not instant peace, but clarity. You start to recognize that love without presence, consistency, or willingness is not something you can build stability on. You begin to understand that your emotional depth is not the problem. It was never the problem. The issue was the mismatch between your availability and theirs. And that realization, while painful, is also grounding, because it brings the situation back into reality instead of fantasy or hope. And from that point, something important shifts. You stop negotiating with absence. You stop interpreting silence as hidden meaning. You stop shrinking yourself to fit into someone else's emotional limitations. You begin to see that the right kind of connection will not require you to constantly question where you stand. It will not disappear when things become real. It will not leave you in a constant state of uncertainty. The long-term healing comes when you finally accept that what ended does not need to be endlessly solved. It only needs to be released. And in that release, you don't just lose a person, you also regain your attention, your emotional energy, and your ability to invest in something that is mutual. Over time, the weight softens, not because the memory disappears, but because it no longer controls your present. And that is where real closure quietly begins. Not in answers, but in your decision to no longer wait for them,